criminal justice reform. President Donald Trump and several Democratic candidates head to South Carolina. We'll tell you why. Saying goodbye. Thousands gather for the funeral of Representative Elijah Cummings. Synod on the Amazon, a preview of the final document from one of its authors. And defending religious freedom, an update on Little Sisters of the Poor and its attempt to be exempt from the contraception mandate. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, October 25th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Jason Calvi. Investigating the investigators. The Justice Department launches a criminal investigation into the origins of the 2016 Russia probe, and President Trump predicts they'll find really bad things. White House correspondent Mark Irons joins us with that story. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Jason. The president is unhappy about the current impeachment inquiry. He calls it a witch hunt. That's a phrase he used to describe the Russia probe. And today he continues to place blame on the Russia probe investigators.
I will tell you this. I think you're going to see a lot of really bad things.
President Trump says he'll leave the investigation into the Russia probe up to the Attorney General.
I think you'll see things that nobody would have believed. This was the worst hoax in the history of our country.
At the same time, President Trump is under scrutiny for a July phone call with the president of Ukraine, which has sparked an impeachment investigation. Even if the House votes to impeach him, President Trump says he will not be convicted in the Senate.
Only for one reason. I did nothing wrong. The only reason. I had a perfect conversation with the president of Ukraine. Perfect.
The former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine testified President Trump withheld military aid from the foreign country until it agreed to investigate Joe Biden and his son Hunter. But senior counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, denies that claim.
That's one person's testimony. There's been other testimony. Ambassador Sondland made very clear in a text to Ambassador Taylor that that was not the president's intent. There was no quid pro quo.
President Trump claims the impeachment probe is actually an attack on the GOP.
Because this isn't a takedown of the president. This is a takedown of the Republican Party. And frankly, the Democrats should be ashamed of themselves.
Some Republicans on Capitol Hill, like Senator Lindsey Graham, say the White House needs a coordinated message and effort to defend against this impeachment probe. When the president was asked today if he needs a bolstered team to take care of that, the president said he is the team. Jason?
Okay, White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thanks, Mark. And Democrats kicked off their impeachment inquiry nearly a month ago, but things aren't slowing down. House investigators issue subpoenas to 3 more Trump administration officials. They're looking at President Donald Trump's request that Ukraine investigate his foes. And was that request in exchange for military aid? We turn now to the spokesperson for the Heritage Foundation, Genevieve Wood. She joins us by Skype. Now, Democrats subpoena more Trump administration officials. What does this signal?
Well, it signals more of the same. I mean, they've been subpoenaing Trump officials since, frankly, President Trump took the oath of office in 2017 to become president. This investigation is just part of other investigations because I don't think Democrats have a real policy agenda. I don't think yet we know that there's any there in their current impeachment inquiry, they call it. And look, I mean, Jason, as you know, you cover Washington. Everybody we're talking about here is a politician. Everybody's got skin in the game. And in my view, that's why as an American citizen, I would like to just see them be very transparent about this whole thing. If he's done something wrong, if it's an impeachable offense, I want to know it. But I'm not going to just take the majority of Democrats' word for it because they have as much skin in this game as the president does.
Well, we've seen the House Republicans bringing up the same issue you just mentioned. They stormed a secure room this week. They demanded transparency. We saw them delaying testimony by storming that secured room in the House. And then we saw yesterday Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham introducing a resolution condemning these closed-door interviews. What are your thoughts on how this investigation is going forward?
Well, look, as we all know, impeachment is a political type prosecution, so it's not happening in a courtroom. The Democrats run the House of Representatives, so they can do this however they want. but there could be repercussions for doing it however you want if you're keeping the American people out of it. And I think that's the real debate. I think it's right for Republicans to really bring this up. They should be making the case for transparency. Again, if the president has done something wrong, if he has done something that fits the level of a high crime and misdemeanor, we should all know about it. But the only way we're all going to know about it is if we're all allowed to come into the room and see the evidence.
Well, this brand new investigation, Mark Irons just told us about the Justice Department launching a criminal investigation now. It's turning that probe into the administration level to a criminal probe. Critics are saying President Trump and his allies may be using the powers of the government to go after their opponents. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I'd like to see the evidence of that. Look, we have all for some time wanted to know, where did the Steele dossier come from? How did this investigation into the Trump campaign get started? That's a valid question, especially when it turns out there was no there either. So I think it's important. I mean, and look, and the fact this has gone to a criminal investigation means that this is going to be a more powerful investigation. It gives them more ability to call a grand jury, among other things. So I think it's, again, in both cases and on both sides, let's just have this all play out where we can all see it.
Genevieve Wood, spokesperson for the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jason.
And President Trump says the criminal justice system can be deeply unfair, and it can lead to a tragic cycle of poverty, crime, and incarceration. He says that's why last year he signed into law the First Step Act. It helps federal inmates re-enter society.
I knew criminal justice reform was not about politics. To this day, not sure that what I did was a popular thing or an unpopular thing, but I know it was the right thing to do.
President Trump spoke this afternoon at Benedict College. It's a historically black college in Columbia, South Carolina. The top Democratic presidential candidates will outline their plans for criminal justice reform at that same school this weekend. The Democratic Party ups its requirements for candidates to make the cut for the December debate. Today, White House hopeful Pete Buttigieg spoke about it on the campaign trail.
We can't go on forever with tons of candidates, but also need to be sure that it's fair to everybody. We take the rules as they're given as a campaign.
Democratic leaders laid out the new requirements for the December debate. Candidates must have at least 200,000 donors and 800 donors per state in at least 20 states. Candidates must also reach 4% in several polls. They have to qualify by December 12th. That's a week before that debate. Former presidents remember Democratic Congressman Elijah Cummings. They spoke at his funeral in Baltimore, as did his daughter.
Our connection was and remains one of heart, spirit, and soul. It is almost impossible to put that connection into words, but I am deeply grateful for it. And today, I just want to say thank you, Daddy.
Prominent Democrats joined the Cummings family in honoring the lawmaker. That includes former presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi spoke about the bipartisan crowd. Conservative Republicans Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan were there. Cummings died October 17th of long-standing problems. He was 68. Iraqi police fire bullets into the air to break up protests in Baghdad. They're protesting corruption, unemployment, and the lack of basic services in Iraq. They picked up again today after a 3-week break. Nearly 150 people have been killed in the violence. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson urges opposition leaders to agree to his plan to hold a general election in December.
As far as I can see at the moment, the Labour Party is split from top to bottom, and they can't work out whether or not they're in favour of an election, which is the thing they're supposed to be campaigning for the last 3.5 years.
Britain is scheduled to leave the EU on October 31st. Prime Minister Johnson struggles to get lawmakers to pass his Brexit deal, so the country asks for a 3-month extension to that deadline. Cardinal Jean Tong is calling for a peaceful solution to the protests in Hong Kong. The apostolic administrator for that territory says citizens should rely on hope instead of anger, and he asks government officials to truly listen to the voice of the disillusioned young people. The Cardinal was speaking with Vatican Radio. Pope Francis apologizes after people threw controversial statues into the Tiber River. He also says the statues have been recovered and are not damaged. The Pope spoke during a session of the Vatican Synod on the Amazon. He says, as bishop of this diocese, I ask forgiveness from those who have been offended by this gesture. The bishops' meeting on the Amazon is almost over, and Synod members tomorrow will vote on the final document.
È evidente che parlare di un rito amazzonico vuol dire parlare di una cosa molto complessa.
The Vatican's communications head says the topics are very complex and they can't be summarized in one paragraph. The bishops will then hand the final document over to Pope Francis. Cardinal Christoph Schönborn, Archbishop of Vienna, joins us from Rome. Your Eminence, you're on the drafting committee of the final document. Will it call for married priests and women deacons in the Amazon?
You know, for me, there are two approaches to the synod. The one is the ecological challenge, which is probably underestimated by many people. Recently, in the last day of the general meetings in the synod, German climate experts said that the death of Amazonia is the death of the world. Some people said this is, of course, exaggerated. But what is true, probably, what I believe, is that the key word of this synod, conversion, is, so to say, the all-embracing question in this synod. Conversion. Conversion, as a bishop of the region said, you in the rich countries, you want us to save the forest, the Amazonian forest, which is certainly one of the most important lungs of the world. You want us to save the Amazonian forest, but you do not want to change your style of life. The question of married priests, I myself said, well, first, do you have married deacons? Vatican II has opened the possibility of married deacons. And I said, this is a kind of laboratory where you can see how it works. Married priests, married deacons with family, having their professional life and working as volunteers for the church, for their parish, baptizing, blessing marriages and making funerals and all these possibilities of permanent deacons. And perhaps if the church decides it is possible that the one or the other, some of them, one day may become ordained priests. It's not to be excluded. But before asking these questions, we have to ask these other questions, which have perhaps not been sufficiently treated in the synod.
And Your Eminence, I wanted to ask you about this week. Two people took controversial statues from a church and threw them into the Tiber River. Now, some said they were statues, those were idols, that people bowed down to them. The others said it was just a symbol of life. I'm just wondering what your take is on that controversy.
During the whole synod, I was sitting in front of one of these statues, and I never found it scandalous. I guess yourself and myself, we have been in a mother's womb. It's a representation of an Indian woman with a child in her womb. And I think we are in the Catholic Church fighting for life. And these people have a deep sense of the sacredness of life. I really can't see any reason to blame this representation of a pregnant woman.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Your Eminence, for your time. Cardinal Christoph Schönborn, Archbishop of Vienna.
All the best.
Coming up, we'll talk about the latest developments regarding U.S. troops and Syria. U.S. troops will head to eastern Syria to protect oil fields. Defense Secretary Mark Esper says the move is to counter a threat from ISIS. The president earlier ordered other troops out of the country. Esper says the mission remains the same, to defeat the Islamic State. Let's talk about this with Aykan Erdemir, a former member of Turkey's parliament and senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. What's the importance of these oil fields in Syria?
Now, northeast Syria contains a vast majority of Syria's oil production. And in fact, the fact that the SDF control these oil fields, it was a crippling blow to the Assad regime. But now that the U.S. is withdrawing from areas, there is a likelihood that the Assad regime will regain control of these territories, and which will provide him with a lifeline. And in the unlikely case that there is an Islamic State resurgence and they take control of these oil fields, of course, it will be a boost to their resurgence.
So these oil fields were protected by the Kurds? That's what you said?
Definitely, we've had around 1,000 U.S. special troops and the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are Kurdish-led, but which also bring together Syriac Christians, Yazidis, and Arabs. And this force together protected the oil fields.
Okay. Now, the president pulled other American troops out of Syria, and then Turkey attacked the Kurds. So how likely is this recent ceasefire going to last?
Now, for the time being, the ceasefire appears to be working, with one exception. In the narrow strip of land controlled by Turkey between Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain, we see sporadic clashes between Turkey-backed militia and the remaining SDF forces. But in general, it seems the Assad forces and Russia are now in charge on the Turkish border. They're beginning to control larger parts of northeast Syria. And this, of course, means that in the days to come, the SDF and the communities it protects and represents will have less and less of a say in the way in which they run their own affairs.
And we're referring to the SDF. Remind our audience what group that is.
Now, the Syrian Democratic Forces is the military wing of the Syrian Democratic Council, which brings together northeast Syria's Kurds, Arabs, Syriac Christians, Yazidis, and Turkmen. And this umbrella organization has been the key partner to the United States, and they managed to put together a relatively inclusive system that ensured that ethnic and religious minorities in this part no longer suffer the kind of persecution they suffered at the hands of the Islamic State.
Let's talk about ISIS, the Islamic State. I mean, what is the status of that terrorist organization right now in Syria?
Now, territorially, the Islamic State was defeated thanks to the partnership of U.S. Special Forces and the SDF. Their militants were either in detention centers or their supporters were in these, centers in northeast Syria. But with the Turkish offensive in northeast Syria, we have seen that a couple of hundred of these militants have managed to escape, with more looking for opportunities to escape. This is a major risk because once they regroup, this could lead to a resurgence of the Islamic State, particularly because what was defeated was the territorial entity and not the ideology. This extremist ideology is still there and can win adherents. And that's, I think, what the U.S. administrators are trying to deal with at this point.
Well, I'd love to talk to you more about that in the future. Aykan Erdemir, Senior Fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, Pope Francis tells the faithful how to win the battle between good and evil, and new developments in the Little Sisters of the Poor's attempt to have an exemption from the federal contraception mandate.
chi ti ha aiutato a fare queste cose, sia la brutta o sia la buona?
Pope Francis says the struggle between good and evil exists in all of us. The Holy Father calls us to judge whether our desires and decisions are coming from the Lord or from the devil. At his daily Mass, he also said God is ready to help. All we have to do is ask. Why did an abortion doctor keep more than 2,000 baby remains in his home and car? His wife says we may never know the answer. Dr. Ulrich Klopfer performed more than 50,000 abortions over 4 decades. His family found the baby remains after he died. Illinois police returned them to Indiana, and state leaders there say the babies will get a proper burial. The Little Sisters of the Poor are once again taking their case to the U.S. Supreme Court. They want the court to take up their case. It comes after a second appeals court ruled against the sisters' exemption from the federal contraception mandate. That mandate requires employers to pay for health insurance that covers contraception, sterilization, and abortion-inducing drugs. Let's talk about this with one of the attorneys on the case, Diana Vorm of Beckett. And Beckett represented EWTN in its lawsuit against the contraceptive mandate. How in the world are the Little Sisters of the Poor back in court?
It's a good question. In 2016, the Supreme Court heard the Little Sisters case. They sent it back to the lower courts and told the government to find a solution that would work for everyone. The government did that. The Trump administration issued an executive order telling the agencies to fix it, and they did. They issued a religious exemption for all religious objectors. How we're back in court now is that the states have sued the federal government and told the federal government that they cannot exempt the Little Sisters of the Poor from the contraceptive mandate.
And their argument?
Their argument is that the government has to use nuns to get contraceptives to women. They're saying that the government doesn't have authority to exempt religious objectors from the mandate.
And what does that mean for your clients, the Little Sisters of the Poor, which they run nursing homes across the country, places like Denver and Chicago and right here in Washington, D.C.?
Exactly. The Little Sisters have been dealing with this since 2011, and they just want to go back to focusing on their ministry, serving the most vulnerable in our society. This means that they have to stay in court to protect their right to a religious objection.
Now, President Trump did issue some new executive orders on religious freedom and things like that. How come those are not protecting the sisters in this particular case?
The Trump administration has issued religious exemptions that should protect the Little Sisters, and the state's lawsuits have stopped the government from implementing those exemptions.
Okay, I see. It seems kind of like almost like Groundhog's Day. Every day you wake up and you thought you won the case, and now you're back in court again.
Exactly. The Little Sisters have been dealing with this for so long, and they're ready to be done with court, and that's why it's time for the Supreme Court to step in and finally resolve this once and for all, and tell the government that it has to protect the Little Sisters from the contraceptive mandate.
So you just recently asked the Supreme Court to get involved because there was a loss. You guys had a loss in several circuits, several appeals courts. What were the rulings against the Little Sisters of the Poor at the appeals court level?
So the courts of appeals, the Ninth Circuit and the Third Circuit, have both ruled against the Little Sisters. So we have asked the Supreme Court to step in and take the case. We're hoping that the court will consider this case this term. We'll find out this winter whether or not they will.
And how is this case important, I guess, for broader considerations of religious freedom?
The state's arguments really go to the idea that the government can't exempt religious objectors from neutral laws. So the Little Sisters are standing up for their right for a religious exemption and the right of all religious objectors in lots of cases.
Okay, well, Diana Vorm, Senior Counsel with Beckett, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate it very much. And finally tonight, we bring you an unimpeachable fact. Tonight, Washington, D.C. is set to host its first World Series game since 1933, and the city is ready. The Washington Nationals will face the Houston Astros in Game 3. Earlier this week, thousands of fans attended a party at the stadium to watch the game on TV. Nationals red and the trademark swirling W have become common sights across the nation's capital, but the W also stands for wins. The Nationals lead the best-of-7 series 2-0. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, we thank you for watching tonight. We'll be back next week with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.